poor cowboy bought a ruined ranch for $10, but what he found inside was worth $5 million. A poor cowboy, broke and weary, raises his hand at a dusty county auction. Townsfolk laugh when he wins a ruined ranch for just $10, mocked as worthless, fit only for coyotes and weeds. But when he pries open the barn ruins, he doesn't find junk. He finds maps and deeds whispering of silver veins and promises long buried in lies. As church bells toll and railroad men ride in with steel eyes and burning torches, the cowboy's $10 gamble turns into a fight for land, justice, and survival. A proud widow and her children stand beside him, but every choice draws him deeper into a storm of greed and betrayal. The ranch may hide fortune beyond his wildest dreams, but what price must he pay to claim it? And when the truth of those papers comes to light, will he end up with riches or ruin? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. Christopher Boone pulled his horse to a stop outside the Trinidad courthouse, dust settling around their weary frames. His boots hit the packed earth with a soft thud, joints creaking from days in the saddle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as he tied his mount to the hitching post. Inside, the county auction was already underway. The wood-paneled room smelled of tobacco and sweat, filled with the low murmur of townsfolk gathered for the monthly property sale. Christopher found a spot near the back, his hat clutched respectfully in calloused hands. The auctioneer's voice rang out sharp and clear. Next up, the old Matthews place, 200 acres, house and barn included. He cleared his throat. Property's been abandoned these past 2 years. Wells run dry, fences down, starting bid at $10. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Christopher studied the faces around him. Merchants in pressed suits, ranchers in worn denims, all shaking their heads at the worthless offer. $10? The auctioneer repeated. Do I hear $10 for this fine piece of... He paused, searching for words. This fine piece of property? More chuckles filled the room. Christopher felt something stir in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. His hand rose slowly into the air. Well now, the auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. We have $10 from the gentleman in the back. He scanned the crowd expectantly. Do I hear 15? The silence was heavy with mockery. Someone coughed. Another person whispered loudly, Fool's money. Going once. The auctioneer's gavel hovered. Going twice. The room held its collective breath. Sold to the gentleman for $10. Christopher made his way forward through the parting crowd, aware of the pitying glances and head shakes following him. His boots echoed on the wooden floor as he approached the desk to complete the purchase. His $10, nearly the last of his money, disappeared into the county clerk's strongbox. Sign here, the clerk said, pushing forward a deed. Christopher gripped the pen carefully, his signature rough but legible. The document was officially stamped and handed over. Just like that, he was a landowner. The rest of the day passed slowly. He treated himself to a hot meal at the boarding house, beans, cornbread, and coffee, knowing it might be his last proper supper for a while. As twilight approached, he gathered his few possessions and headed toward his new property. The road wound through scrubby hills, the spring evening alive with cricket song. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. After about an hour's ride, he spotted the broken fence line marking the boundary of his land. Christopher dismounted, leading his horse through the gap where a gate should have been. The house stood dark against the purpling sky, a squat, weathered structure with a roof that sagged like a tired back. The barn listed to one side, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. He tied his horse to what remained of the front porch rail and walked the property as the light faded. The well stood silent, its wooden cover warped and splintering. He worked the pump handle, nothing but a dry wheeze of air. In the overgrown yard, tumbleweeds had gathered against the house like tired travelers. The windows were intact, though filmed with dust and cobwebs. Inside, the rooms smelled of abandonment and mouse droppings. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved through the empty spaces. A stone hearth dominated the main room, cold ashes still piled within. Night settled fully around him as he returned to collect his bedroll from his saddle. Coyotes began their evening chorus in the distance, their cries echoing off the hills. The sound only emphasized the crushing solitude of the place. Christopher spread his bedroll near the hearth, using his saddle as a pillow. The darkness pressed close, broken only by strips of starlight through the grimy windows. He could feel the weight of the empty house around him, years of silence and neglect hanging heavy in the air. Closing his eyes, Christopher clasped his hands together. His whispered prayer barely disturbed the dust motes floating in the dim light. Lord, let there be more here than what men see. The words settled into the darkness like seeds waiting for rain. Christopher pulled his blanket closer, listening to the night sounds of his new home, the creak of old timber, the whisper of wind through cracks, the distant coyotes. Sleep came slowly, but it came with dreams of possibility, of what might grow from $10 worth of faith. The moon rose over his sanctuary of broken fences and sagging roofs, casting silver light across land that others had deemed worthless. But in the quiet of that first night, Christopher Boone had planted something precious in that tired soil. Hope, taking root in the dark. The first grey light of dawn crept through the grimy windows, rousing Christopher from his uneasy sleep by the cold hearth. His back protested as he pushed himself up from the hard floor, muscles stiff from days in the saddle and a night on rough boards. Outside, a rooster's distant crow echoed across the valley, calling him to work. After seeing to his horse and sharing a meager breakfast of jerky from his saddlebags, Christopher stepped out onto the weathered porch. The morning air held a bite, but the promise of spring whispered in the breeze. He pulled his coat tighter and surveyed his new kingdom in the growing light. The yard before him told a story of neglect. Waist-high weeds choked what might have once been a garden. The barn's roof had partially collapsed, creating a jumble of splintered beams and rotted shingles. To his right, a chicken coop lay scattered like dropped matchsticks, its wire mesh rusted and torn. The corral posts listed at drunken angles, their bases eaten away by time and weather. Christopher drew a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Well, he muttered to himself, ain't gonna fix itself by staring at it. He started with the barn, figuring it held the most salvageable lumber. The morning sun climbed higher as he worked, sorting through the wreckage. Good boards went in one pile, damaged but usable in another, and truly rotted pieces in a third for burning. His hands, soft from winter's idle months, soon raised blisters that burst and bled. The work was slow and grinding. Every beam had to be checked, every nail pulled carefully to save for reuse. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool air. When his stomach growled at midday, he barely paused long enough to drink from his canteen and chew another strip of jerky. By late afternoon, Christopher had cleared nearly half the barn's remains. His shoulders ached, and fresh blisters had formed over the morning's wounds. But beneath the surface wreckage, he began to find traces of the farm's better days: a rusted hay fork with a solid handle, a leather harness that might clean up decent, a box of bent but fixable hinges. The sun was lowering toward the western hills when his crowbar struck something solid under a pile of warped timbers. The hollow ring of metal on metal caught his attention. Setting aside his tool, Christopher dropped to his knees and began clearing debris with renewed energy. Gradually, an iron-bound trunk emerged from its wooden tomb. It was a substantial piece, built of thick oak with heavy metal straps and a sturdy lock. The wood had weathered the years well, protected by its shelter of fallen timbers. Christopher ran his fingers over the lock, finding it solid despite its age. "Now what secrets are you keeping?" He wondered aloud. The trunk was too well made to break apart, but the lock might yield to persuasion. Retrieving his crowbar, Christopher worked the metal tip carefully between the lock and its hasp. His muscles, tired from the day's labor, protested as he applied steady pressure. With a sharp crack, the lock gave way. Christopher sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dusty sleeve. The setting sun painted the barn's remains in shades of gold and shadow as he lifted the trunk's heavy lid. The musty smell of old paper rose from within. Christopher's hands trembled slightly as he lifted out the contents. Folded papers, their creases brittle with age. Some were clearly survey maps, their careful lines showing familiar landmarks around the property. Others were deeds and letters, the ink faded but still readable. Night was falling fast. Christopher gathered the papers carefully and made his way back to the house. He lit the oil lamp he'd brought from town, setting it on the kitchen table. The yellow light cast dancing shadows on the walls as he spread the documents before him. Hours passed as Christopher pored over the materials. The handwriting in the oldest letters dated back 30 years, telling a story of hope and ambition. His breath caught as he read one passage again and again. The silver lodes beneath Dry Creek show great promise. Initial samples exceed expectations. With proper investment, the veins could yield substantial returns. More papers confirmed the writer's excitement. Detailed maps marking promising sites, assay reports showing silver content, sketched plans for mining operations. But something had happened. Some reason the work never proceeded. Christopher searched for answers until his eyes burned from strain and the lamp began to sputter. He didn't remember laying his head down, but sleep found him there at the table, surrounded by the ghosts of paper dreams. The lamp burned lower and lower, its flame casting long shadows across maps that whispered of treasure hiding beneath his worthless land. Outside, a coyote's lonely call echoed through the darkness, but Christopher slept on, his blistered hand still resting on the precious documents that might change everything. The light burned low, its dim glow illuminating the peaceful face of a man who had started the day with nothing but faith and ended it with the weight of possibility resting beneath his calloused fingers. Morning sunlight streamed through Trinidad's dusty main street as Christopher made his way to Haskell's general store, the precious papers tucked safely in his coat. His boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk, each step measured and purposeful. The store's bell jangled as he pushed open the door, stepping into the familiar smell of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco. "Well, if it ain't our new rancher," Tom Haskell called out from behind the counter, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Come to buy supplies for that heap of kindling you bought yesterday?" Several men lounging near the pot-bellied stove turned to look, their faces showing more amusement than welcome. Christopher kept his expression neutral as he approached the counter, drawing out the documents. "Found these in an old trunk," he said quietly, spreading the maps and deeds across the worn wooden surface. "Wanted to see what you make of them." Tom adjusted his spectacles, peering down at the yellowed papers. Other customers drifted closer, curiosity drawing them in despite their initial disdain. The store grew quiet except for the crinkle of paper and the distant tick of the wall clock. "Silver mines?" Tom scoffed, straightening up. "Boy, every fool and his brother claimed to find silver out there 30 years ago. Ain't nothing but limestone and hard luck in those hills." Laughter rippled through the gathered men. Might as well be chasing ghosts, someone added from the back. Christopher opened his mouth to argue, but movement near the flour barrel caught his eye. A native woman stood quietly watching, her dark eyes intent on the papers. She wore a simple calico dress, but carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly braided, and a beaded shawl draped her shoulders. While the men continued their jokes, she finished measuring flour into her cloth bag, paid in careful counted pennies, and made her way to the door. As she passed Christopher, she met his gaze briefly, then glanced meaningfully towards the street outside. Christopher gathered his papers, deaf to the continued ribbing. "Much obliged for your time," he said to Tom, touching the brim of his hat before following the woman outside. She waited for him near the hitching post, her flour bag settled at her feet. "I am Naomi Whitefeather," she said simply, her voice carrying the melody of her native tongue beneath the English words. "Christopher Boone," he replied, noting the wisdom in her weathered face and the strength in her careful stance. "Those papers you carry," she said, gesturing with a slight movement of her chin, "they speak of more than silver." Her eyes held his steadily. "My father, he told stories of that land, of promises made and broken, of men who wore law like a stolen blanket." Christopher's throat tightened. "Mom, I'd be grateful to hear what you know." Naomi glanced at the store windows, where curious faces quickly ducked away. "Not here," she said. "Some stories need open sky to be told true." She pointed toward the edge of town. "I walk this way. You may walk also, if you wish to learn." They walked in silence for several minutes, their footsteps raising small clouds of dust. When the buildings thinned and the prairie opened before them, Naomi spoke again. 30 summers ago, that land belonged to my people," she said. "Not by paper, but by the old ways. We hunted there, gathered medicines from the valleys. Then silver was whispered of, and suddenly the county judge had deeds appearing like mushrooms after rain." Christopher pulled out one of the documents. "Judge Morgan Blackwood?" Naomi nodded, her face growing stern. "A man who spoke sweet words while writing bitter ones. He took more than land, he took trust." She paused, adjusting her shawl against the morning breeze. "The papers you found, they tell his true story, yes?" Christopher shuffled through the sheets, finding a letter he'd studied the night before. "There's correspondence here about claim jumping, fake surveys." His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. He wasn't just stealing silver rights, he was stealing treaty land. "Now you begin to see," Naomi said softly. "These papers you carry, they are like a knife that cuts two ways. They may show you where silver sleeps in the earth, but they also show how it was stolen from those who walked there first." They had reached the fork in the road where their paths would part. Naomi turned to face Christopher fully. "What will you do with this knowledge, Christopher Boone? Will you be like those who came before, seeing only the shine of silver? Or will you look deeper, to where true value lies?" Christopher stood silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of the papers in his coat, the warmth of the rising sun on his face, and the quiet strength of the woman before him. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that a man's soul is worth more than silver, and justice is worth more than both." Naomi's expression softened slightly. Then perhaps these papers found the right hands after all. She gathered her shawl closer. "Good day to you, Christopher Boone. May your eyes stay clear and your heart stay true." The sun was setting when Christopher finally returned to his ranch, his mind heavy with all he'd learned. He built a small fire in the hearth, its warmth pushing back the evening chill. As his beans simmered in their tin pot, he spread the papers out once more on the rough floor. This time, he read them with new eyes. Beyond the maps marking silver deposits, he found the evidence of Naomi's words. Carefully worded letters spoke of relocating inconvenient claims. Survey dates conflicted with treaty documents. Judge Blackwood's flowing signature appeared again and again, witnessing deeds that should never have existed. Christopher spooned his beans into a chipped bowl, barely tasting them as he continued reading. The fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows across pages that told their damning story. Here was wealth, yes, but bought with lies and sealed with betrayal. Sleep came slowly that night. Christopher lay on his bedroll, watching the last embers pulse red in the darkness. The papers were back in their trunk, but their weight pressed on his heart. Silver waited in the hills, enough perhaps to make him rich. But Naomi's question echoed in his mind. What would he do with this knowledge? Outside, a nighthawk called into the darkness, its voice lonely and questioning. Christopher turned onto his side, pulling his blanket closer. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it decisions that would test not just his courage, but his very soul. The morning sun cast long shadows across Trinidad's dusty main street as Christopher tied his horse outside the courthouse. The building loomed before him, its red brick facade still cool from the night air. He adjusted his hat, gathered the papers from his saddlebag, and climbed the worn wooden steps. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of old paper and coal oil. A brass wall clock ticked away the seconds, its sound echoing through the quiet hallway. Christopher's boots creaked against the floorboards as he made his way to the clerk's office. Henry Tate, the county clerk, sat hunched over his desk, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the light from a nearby window. He barely looked up when Christopher entered. "Help you?" Tate's voice carried the bored tone of a man who'd rather be elsewhere. Christopher placed the documents on the desk. "Need to verify some papers, if you'd be so kind." Tate sighed, pushing aside his ledger. He picked up the first deed, his expression changing as he recognized Judge Blackwood's signature. His thin fingers trembled slightly as he shuffled through the maps and letters. "Where'd you get these?" The clerk's voice had lost its boredom, replaced by something closer to worry. "Found them at my ranch," Christopher answered steadily. "The old Morrow place. Bought it at auction 3 days back." Tate's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. He stood abruptly, moving to a tall filing cabinet. The metal drawers scraped as he pulled them open, comparing the documents to those in the county records. "They're genuine enough," he finally said, returning to his desk. His voice dropped lower. "But if you're smart, you'll forget you ever found them." Christopher leaned forward. "Sir." "Some history's best left buried," Tate said, pushing the papers back across the desk. "Trinidad's growing. Railroad's coming. Ain't wise to dig up old troubles." "Reckon truth ain't trouble," Christopher replied quietly. The clerk removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "Your funeral," he muttered. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to attend to." Christopher gathered the documents, tucking them carefully into his coat. The brass clock showed barely 9 in the morning as he stepped back into the street. He'd taken 3 steps toward his horse when a sharp voice called out behind him, "Mr. Boone!" A man in a fine black suit approached, his boots spotless despite the dusty street. A gold watch chain gleamed across his vest, and a derby hat sat precisely on his head. His clean-shaven face wore a smile that never reached his eyes. "Maxwell Turner," he said, extending a manicured hand. "Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. Might I have a word?" Christopher shook the offered hand briefly. "How can I help you, Mr. Turner?" "Actually," Turner's smile widened, "I'm here to help you. I understand you recently acquired the Morrow Ranch property." "That's right." Turner gestured toward the cafe across the street. "Perhaps we could discuss business over coffee." "My treat, of course." Christopher glanced at the sun's position. Prefer to stand, if it's all the same. Got work waiting at the ranch. Very well. Turner's smile tightened. I'll be direct then. The railroad's planning its route through this valley. That land you bought? We need it. I'm prepared to offer you $50, 5 times what you paid. A generous profit for 3 days' ownership. Christopher felt the weight of the documents inside his coat. Not interested in selling. Mr. Boone. Turner's voice hardened. Let's be reasonable. That land's worthless for ranching. No water, poor soil. The railroad's offering you a fair deal. Still not selling. The railroad agent's smile vanished entirely. The train's coming, Mr. Boone, one way or another. Smart men profit from progress, stubborn ones. He paused, adjusting his derby hat. Well, they tend to get run over by it. Christopher met the man's cold stare. That a threat, Mr. Turner? Simply stating facts. Railroads got friends in high places. Courts, banks, territorial office. Turner brushed invisible dust from his sleeve. Be a shame if someone with no resources tried to fight progress. Might find himself buried in legal fees. Or worse. Appreciate your concern, Christopher said evenly. But that land's mine. Fair and square. Turner's laugh held no warmth. Fair, square? Wake up, man. This is business. The railroad takes what it needs. He stepped closer, dropping his voice. You've got 1 week to reconsider my offer. After that, things get complicated. Christopher said nothing, watching as the railroad agent strode away, disappearing into the growing morning crowd. Only then did he notice his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. The ride back to his ranch seemed longer than usual. The afternoon sun beat down as Christopher guided his horse past broken fences and overgrown fields. The deeds in his coat felt heavier with each mile. He spent the remaining daylight gathering lumber from the collapsed barn, selecting the straightest boards he could find. As evening approached, he began nailing them across the cabin's windows. The sharp report of his hammer echoed across the empty land. The last light was fading when he finished. Christopher stood back, studying his work. The boards looked stark against the weathered logs, but they'd hold. Whether against men or nature remained to be seen. Inside, he lit a lamp and set it on the crude table. Shadows danced across the walls as he knelt beside his bedroll. The day's events weighed on his mind. The clerk's warning, Turner's threats, the growing sense that his $10 purchase had stirred up more than he'd bargained for. Lord, he whispered into the quiet room, I ain't asking for much. Just the strength to do what's right. And maybe, he added after a pause, the wisdom to know what that is. The lamp flickered, making the boarded windows cast crisscrossed shadows on the floor. Outside, a coyote called into the gathering night, its voice carrying across the empty miles. Christopher remained kneeling, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But for now, in the silence of his humble home, he prayed for courage to face whatever came. The morning sun painted the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold as Christopher saddled his horse. He'd been up since before dawn, unable to sleep with all that weighed on his mind. The railroad's threats echoed in his thoughts, but so did Naomi's words about broken promises and stolen land. He rode along the creek bed, where patches of green struggled through the dusty soil. The sound of bleating goats drew his attention to a gentle slope ahead. There stood Naomi Whitefeather, wrapped in a worn shawl against the morning chill, watching over her small herd. Christopher dismounted, leading his horse by the reins. "Morning, Mrs. Whitefeather." She turned, her dark eyes studying him carefully. "Mr. Boone." She held a carved wooden staff, using it to guide a wayward kid back towards the herd. "Wanted to thank you," Christopher said, removing his hat, "for telling me the truth about this land, about what happened here." Naomi nodded slowly, her face softening. Truth is like water, Mr. Boone. We all need it to live. Would you— He cleared his throat. Would you tell me more? About the old agreements? She was quiet for a long moment, watching her goats browse among the scrub brush. Finally, she settled onto a sun-warmed boulder, her staff across her lap. It was 30 summers ago. My father was among the leaders who met with the white officials. Christopher sat on a fallen log nearby, listening as she spoke of how the Ute people had farmed the fertile valley for generations. How men in suits had arrived with papers, speaking of progress and civilization. They said we must sign, she continued, her voice steady but touched with old pain. Said it was for our own good. My father knew better, but they brought soldiers with their papers. What choice did we have? She described how families were moved to rocky soil where nothing would grow, how promises of tools and seeds never materialized. Her own father had died that first bitter winter, along with many others. The papers you found, she said, meeting Christopher's eyes. They tell this story? He nodded. Some of it shows how Judge Blackwood gave himself the best land, sold the rest to his friends. All illegal-like. The sun climbed higher as they talked. Christopher noticed Naomi glancing at the empty water skin beside her. My well's working, he offered. Not much water, but it's clean. Would you like to fill your skin? A smile touched her weathered face. Much obliged. They walked together towards the ranch, the goats following at their own pace. At the well, Christopher grabbed the rope, then laughed as the ancient pulley groaned in protest. Stubborn thing, he muttered, straining against the weight of the full bucket. Naomi chuckled, a warm, unexpected sound. Like an old mule, she agreed, helping him steady the bucket as water sloshed over the rim. They took turns working the rope, filling Naomi's water skin and several spare buckets she had brought. Despite the work, their laughter came easier with each creaking pull of the pulley. My grandchildren could help with this, Naomi said, wiping her brow. Strong young backs, eager to be useful. Christopher straightened, surprised by the offer. I'd welcome the help, he said carefully. And the company. The sun was setting when Naomi returned with 3 children in tow. The oldest, a boy of about 12, carried a cloth-wrapped bundle. His younger sisters, perhaps 8 and 6, held tight to their grandmother's skirts, eyes wide with curiosity. Hope you don't mind, Naomi said, unwrapping a golden-brown cornbread. Seemed wrong to come empty-handed. Christopher hurried to clear space on his rough table. Mind? No, ma'am. It's been a long time since this house had proper guests. The children gradually lost their shyness as the evening wore on. The oldest, Joseph, asked eager questions about the horses in the corral. Sarah, the middle child, discovered a family of mice living behind the hearth and named each one. Little Mary fell asleep in her grandmother's lap, clutching a carved wooden horse Christopher had found in the barn. Naomi broke the cornbread, sharing it with honey she'd brought in a small jar. Christopher contributed the last of his coffee, and they talked as twilight deepened outside the windows. The children's laughter echoed off the log walls, making the old house feel warmer somehow, more alive. Been years since these walls heard such joy, Christopher said softly, watching Joseph teach his sister a string game. Naomi nodded, her eyes bright in the lamplight. Children have a way of bringing life back to empty places. As the evening drew to a close, Christopher stood in his doorway, watching Naomi lead her sleepy grandchildren home by lantern light. Their voices carried back to him on the evening breeze, mixed with the sound of crickets and distant coyotes. For the first time since buying the ranch, the silence that followed didn't feel quite so heavy. He could still hear echoes of laughter in the corners, see the warmth of shared friendship around his table. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, tonight had shown him something precious. The possibility of turning this empty house into a true home. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Christopher stood at his fence line, studying the broken posts and sagging wire. A meadowlark's song carried across the morning air as he shouldered his tools and got to work. By mid-morning, sweat dampened his shirt as he dug post holes in the hard earth. The spring sun beat down steadily, and his muscles ached from the repetitive motion of the post hole digger. Still he pressed on, measuring careful distances between each new post. "Looks like thirsty work," came Naomi's voice. Christopher straightened, wiping his brow. She stood there with a cloth-covered basket and a water jug, her dark eyes twinkling with amusement at his dusty state. "Much obliged," he said, gratefully accepting a drink. "What brings you out this way?" Naomi set her basket down. "Thought we might start a kitchen garden. Brought some seeds." She gestured to a sunny patch near the house. "Good soil there if it's worked right." Christopher nodded, studying the spot she indicated. "Reckon I could use some fresh vegetables, if they'll grow." Together they cleared the patch of weeds and rocks, turning the soil with hoes and rakes Christopher found in the barn. Naomi showed him how to create raised beds using old boards, explaining how it would help retain precious water. As they worked, wagons occasionally passed on the nearby road. Some folks pointed and snickered at the sight of them working the supposedly worthless land. But others slowed, watching with interest. Old Mrs. Peterson from the general store reined her cart to a stop around noon. "Got some spare turnip seeds?" she called out. "More than I can use this season." She handed down a small paper packet, her weathered face kind. Good to see someone trying to bring life back here. Throughout the afternoon, more townspeople stopped. Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith, offered extra bean seeds. The Cooper children brought a handful of corn kernels their mother had saved. Each small gift came with words of encouragement, as if the sight of honest work had awakened something in the community's heart. As the sun began to set, Christopher and Naomi sat on the porch steps, surveying their day's work. The newly planted garden looked promising, even if small. The repaired fence stretched straight and true along the western boundary. "The Lord provides," came a deep voice from the road. They looked up to see Reverend Matthews, the traveling preacher, leading his horse toward them. His saddlebags were heavy with Bibles and pamphlets from his circuit riding. "Evening, Reverend," Christopher said, standing to offer his hand. "Care to rest a spell?" The preacher settled onto a porch chair, his kind eyes taking in the improvements. "Heard in town some folks were mocking your purchase of this place." He shook his head slowly. "But I see God's hand at work here. Don't give in to despair, son. The good book says hope is an anchor for the soul." Naomi brought out the last of the day's water and some cornbread, which they shared as twilight deepened. The Reverend's words of encouragement seemed to hang in the evening air like a blessing. After the preacher rode on, Naomi retrieved the survey maps from inside. "Been meaning to study these more carefully," she said, spreading them on the porch under Christopher's lantern. They bent over the yellowed papers together, their shoulders nearly touching. Naomi's finger traced the creek's winding path, stopping at certain bends and features. "Here," she said softly. "This mark shows where the creek narrows between two hills. We called it Whispering Waters." Her voice grew distant with memory. "Our summer camp was there, where the wild plums grow thick." Christopher studied the spot she indicated, then checked another map. His breath caught. The Silver Vein. According to these notes, it runs right through that same area. Naomi sat back, understanding dawning in her eyes. So that's why they wanted our people gone so badly. She shook her head slowly. they knew what lay beneath the earth. "This is more than just my property claim now," Christopher said quietly. "These papers, they're proof of what was stolen from your people." Their eyes met in the lantern light, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. The evening breeze carried the scent of spring earth and new possibilities. "Perhaps," Naomi said carefully, "this is why the land came to you for such a small price, so truth could finally come to light." Christopher nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden he carried alone anymore. Together, they studied the maps late into the evening, marking locations they recognized, piecing together a story of justice long delayed but perhaps not denied. The stars were bright overhead when Naomi finally gathered her shawl to leave. She paused at the porch steps, looking back at the little house with its new garden and mended fence. "You've made good changes here," she said softly. "Couldn't have done it without help," Christopher replied, holding the lantern up to light her way. "Will you come back tomorrow?" "There's more fence to mend, and I reckon that garden needs tending." Naomi's smile was warm in the gathering darkness. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll come back." He watched until she disappeared down the moonlit road, then turned back to his house. It felt different now, less lonely, more like somewhere healing could begin, not just for the land, but for all those who had been wronged. The maps lay on his table, testimony to both past injuries and future possibilities. Christopher carefully rolled them up, knowing that tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, but also knowing he no longer faced them alone. The morning sun painted Trinidad's main street in shades of gold as Christopher and Naomi rode side by side toward the courthouse. A week of preparation had steadied their nerves, but Christopher's heart still quickened at the sight of the imposing brick building ahead. Naomi sat tall in her saddle, her dark hair neatly braided, wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but carried dignity in every careful stitch. Christopher had done his best to look respectable too, with a freshly pressed shirt and his father's old string tie. As they dismounted and tied their horses, townsfolk paused in their morning errands. Whispers rippled down the boardwalk like wind through prairie grass. Christopher heard fragments floating past. That worthless ranch. And Indian woman. But he kept his eyes forward, offering Naomi his arm as they climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in its beams. The wooden benches were already filling with curious onlookers. Christopher recognized faces from town. The general store owner, the blacksmith, even old Mrs. Peterson who'd given them turnip seeds. The railroad agent sat near the front, his expensive suit a stark contrast to Christopher's worn boots. He whispered with his lawyer, shooting dark glances their way. But Christopher drew strength from Naomi's steady presence beside him. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes swishing as he took his seat. The room fell silent, save for the tick of the wall clock and the shuffle of papers. "Case regarding ownership of the Morgan Creek property," the clerk announced. "Railroad company claims prior rights versus current deed holder Christopher Boone." The railroad's lawyer rose first, his voice smooth as creek stones. He spoke of progress, of the territory's future, of how the land had been legally acquired decades ago. But when he mentioned uninhabited wilderness, Naomi's hand tightened on her skirt. When Christopher's turn came, he presented the documents from the iron-bound trunk. His voice shook at first, but grew stronger as he explained how he'd found them, what they revealed about the silver deposits and the original agreements with the Ute people. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like Mrs. Whitefeather to speak about her father's experience." Naomi rose slowly, her presence commanding attention despite her simple dress. She spoke with quiet dignity about memories passed down, of summer camps by whispering waters, of her father's reluctant mark on papers he couldn't read, of promises broken like dried twigs. "My father believed in truth," she said, her voice clear as morning light. "He taught us that justice may sleep, but it never dies. These papers prove what our elders always knew." The railroad's lawyer tried to object, but Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. He studied the documents carefully, adjusting his spectacles as he read. The clock ticked 23 times before he looked up. "The court finds these deeds authentic," he declared. "The railroad's claim is denied. Mr. Boone's purchase stands legal and binding." Christopher felt light-headed with relief. Naomi's eyes shone with unshed tears as scattered applause broke out from the benches. The railroad agent stormed out, his lawyer hurrying behind. As they emerged into the sunlight, neighbors pressed forward to shake Christopher's hand. Old Mrs. Peterson hugged Naomi, whispering something that made them both smile. The blacksmith clapped Christopher's shoulder hard enough to stagger him. Word spread through town like wildfire. By evening, the small church's bell began to ring, its clear tone calling people together. Christopher and Naomi arrived to find lanterns strung across the churchyard and tables laden with food. Chicken and biscuits, preserves and pies, everything neighbors could spare to celebrate. Reverend Matthews stood on the church steps, his Bible tucked under one arm. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, smiling. "Sometimes it takes a $10 bid at auction to restore both property and providence." Inside the church, golden lamplight warmed the simple wooden walls. Children darted between pews while adults shared plates and conversation. Christopher noticed how naturally everyone included Naomi, how her grandchildren played with the Cooper kids as if they'd always been friends. Someone started playing a fiddle, and feet began tapping in time. The celebration spilled out onto the church steps, where the evening air carried hints of coming summer. Christopher found himself sharing bread with folks who'd laughed at him just weeks ago. But there was no bitterness now, only the warm feeling of community healing its own wounds. "You've done good," the blacksmith told him, munching on a biscuit. "Reckon that ranch might amount to something after all." "We all did good," Christopher replied, watching Naomi teach Mrs. Peterson's daughter a Ute-clapping game. Sometimes it just takes seeing things fresh to make them right. The moon rose full and bright over the church steeple as the celebration continued. Christopher's heart felt as full as the moon, watching his neighbors, all his neighbors, sharing food and laughter together. When Naomi caught his eye across the churchyard, her smile held all the promise of spring flowers and silver streams. They had won more than a land claim today. They had won the chance to build something new from old wrongs, to plant hope where bitterness once grew. The church bell rang once more as evening deepened, its clear tone carrying across the town like a blessing. The celebration's warmth lingered as Christopher settled into his bedroll that night. Through the window, moonlight spilled across the worn floorboards. His mind drifted to the day's victory, to Naomi's quiet strength in the courthouse, to the way the community had come together. Sleep came easily, deeper than he'd known in weeks. A horse's frightened whinny cut through his dreams. Christopher's eyes snapped open to the acrid smell of smoke. Orange light flickered through the windows, too bright for dawn. His heart lurched as shouts echoed from the direction of the barn. "Fire! Fire in the barn!" Christopher grabbed his boots, not bothering with his shirt. The night air hit his skin as he burst through the door. The sight stopped him cold. Flames already consumed half the barn's roof, reaching hungry fingers towards the sky. Dark figures on horseback galloped away, their shapes blurred by smoke. More shouts drew his attention. Naomi and her grandchildren were running from their nearby cabin, drawn by the commotion. Her eldest grandson, Joseph, raced ahead toward the barn doors. "The horses!" Joseph cried. "We must save them." Christopher sprinted forward, catching up to the boy. Together they wrestled with the heavy doors, finally forcing them open. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking. Inside, horses kicked at their stalls, eyes rolling white with terror. "Cover your face!" Christopher ordered, pulling his bandana over his nose. The heat was incredible, making every breath a struggle. They stumbled forward, working to free the panicked animals. Each second felt like an eternity as they unlatched stalls, slapping horses toward the exit. Naomi appeared at the doorway, leading her younger grandchildren in a bucket line from the well. But the flames moved faster than water could fight them. Timbers groaned overhead, showering sparks. "Joseph!" Christopher called through the smoke. "That's enough! Get out now!" But the boy had pushed deeper into the barn, determined to reach the last horse. Christopher saw him disappear into the thickening smoke. A terrible crack split the air as a burning beam shifted. "Joseph!" Naomi's scream cut through the roar of flames. Christopher plunged after the boy, counting stalls by touch. The smoke burned his eyes, filled his lungs. He found Joseph collapsed near the final stall, overcome by the fumes. Without hesitation, Christopher scooped him up, throwing the boy's limp form over his shoulder. The way back seemed endless. Christopher's lungs screamed for clean air. Sparks rained down, burning his exposed skin. The heat pressed against him like a physical wall. Just when his legs began to buckle, cool night air hit his face. He staggered out into the yard, falling to his knees as gentle hands took Joseph from his arms. Naomi cradled her grandson, checking his breathing. Joseph coughed violently, then drew a shuddering breath. Christopher sagged with relief, his own chest heaving as he gulped fresh air. Behind them, the barn surrendered to the flames. The roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a geyser of sparks towards the stars. Christopher could only watch helplessly as months of work disappeared into the inferno. The livestock they hadn't reached. 2 milk cows, their new calf, 6 chickens. Their frightened cries had gone silent. They worked through the night, fighting to keep the flames from spreading to the house or Naomi's cabin. By the time dawn painted the sky in pale gray, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins. The acrid smell of burnt wood and worse things hung heavy in the air. Christopher stood at the edge of the destruction, his clothes and skin streaked with soot. All around lay blackened timbers and ash, so much ash. The morning breeze stirred it into bitter clouds that danced around his boots. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the scorched earth. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd celebrated just hours before, how quickly it had turned to cinders. The railroad's message was clear. The court's ruling meant nothing to men who took what they wanted by force. Despair crashed over him like a wave, threatening to pull him under. He'd been a fool to think he could stand against such power, a fool to believe $10 and determination could build a real home. His shoulders shook as tears cut clean tracks through the soot on his face. A gentle hand came to rest on his shoulder. Naomi knelt beside him in the ash, her own face streaked with smoke and grief. But her eyes held the same steady strength he'd seen in the courthouse. "The Lord does not abandon his children," she whispered, her voice rough from smoke but unwavering. Her fingers tightened on his shoulder, anchoring him against the tide of despair. Christopher looked at her, seeing his own pain reflected in her eyes, but something more too. Determination, resilience, the kind of faith that had carried her people through generations of loss and still found reason to hope. The sun climbed higher, revealing the full extent of the destruction in harsh detail. But Naomi's hand remained steady on his shoulder, her presence a reminder that even in the ashes, they were not alone. The railroad men had meant to break them. Instead, they had forged a stronger bond between two wounded souls who refused to be driven from their home. Dawn painted the sky in gentle pinks and golds, but Christopher found no beauty in it. His muscles ached from the night's battle with the flames as he stood before the blackened ruins. The morning air still carried the bitter scent of smoke. In his hands he held a worn shovel, a tool meant for planting and building, now needed for a grimmer task. With heavy steps, he approached the charred remains of the animals they couldn't save. Each one had been more than just livestock. They were the beginning of his dream, proof that this broken-down ranch could sustain life again. The young calf, born just 2 weeks ago, lay curved beside its mother as if sleeping. The sight brought tears to his eyes. Christopher chose a spot beneath an old cottonwood tree, where morning shade would linger longest. The earth was hard, but he worked steadily, digging deep enough to honor their sacrifice. As he labored, quiet words of prayer fell from his lips, thanksgiving for the brief time these creatures had shared his home, petition for mercy in the face of such cruelty. "Lord," he whispered, wiping sweat from his brow, "help me understand your purpose in this." From the house came the soft murmur of voices. Through the window he could see Naomi tending to Joseph, who lay recovering on the parlor's worn sofa. The boy had inhaled too much smoke, but his breathing was stronger now. Christopher paused in his work, watching as Naomi pressed a cool cloth to her grandson's forehead with gentle hands. Her quiet strength humbled him. The sun climbed higher as Christopher finished his solemn task. Just as he tamped down the last of the earth, the creak of wagon wheels drew his attention. Several townsfolk were making their way up the rutted drive, their wagons loaded with lumber and tools. Leading them was Tom Wheeler, the general store owner who'd laughed at Christopher's purchase weeks ago. "Heard about the trouble?" Tom called out, pulling his team to a halt. "Thought you might could use some help." Christopher leaned on his shovel, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Much obliged," he managed. More wagons arrived as the morning wore on. Men who'd once mocked his determination now rolled up their sleeves to clear debris. Women bearing covered dishes and baskets filled Naomi's small cabin and Christopher's kitchen. The widow Peterson brought her famous beef stew, while young Sally Matthews distributed fresh-baked bread. By midday, the ranch yard hummed with activity. A dozen men worked to clear the burnt timbers, salvaging what they could. Others began laying out plans for a new barn, arguing good-naturedly about the best design. Their wives had taken over both kitchens, preparing a feast that filled the air with welcome aromas. Christopher worked alongside them all, his heart growing fuller with each passing hour. These weren't just neighbors helping in crisis, they were becoming family, bound together by something stronger than blood. Inside the house, Joseph had improved enough to sit up and take some broth. Naomi kept close watch, but allowed herself small smiles at the bustle around her. Children darted between the workers, carrying water and tools, their laughter a healing balm after the previous night's terror. As evening approached, the work slowed. Women began setting out food on makeshift tables, planks laid across sawhorses. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with wood smoke from the cooking fires. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon toe-tapping music lifted spirits higher. Darkness fell, but no one seemed eager to leave. Lanterns were lit, casting warm pools of light across the yard. The crowd moved inside as the evening air cooled, filling Christopher's small house with more life than it had known in decades. In the parlor, Reverend Stevens raised his voice in the opening notes of "Amazing Grace." Others joined in, their harmonies swelling until the very walls seemed to vibrate with praise. Christopher stood near the fireplace, watching faces illuminated by lamplight. These were the same people who'd dismissed him as a fool just weeks ago. Now they sang beside him, shared his table, pledged their help in rebuilding. The singing continued as plates were passed and stories shared. Christopher found himself seated beside Naomi on the sofa, their shoulders touching comfortably. Joseph dozed in a chair nearby. Color finally returned to his cheeks. As the evening wore on, folks began to drift home, leaving behind promises to return tomorrow. Soon only Naomi remained, helping Christopher gather empty plates and cups. The house felt different now, warmer somehow, as if it had absorbed the evening's fellowship into its very boards. They worked in companionable silence until the kitchen was set to rights. Then Christopher sank into a chair by the dying fire, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Naomi settled nearby, her dark eyes reflecting the glowing embers. "I reckon I never expected this," Christopher said softly, gesturing to encompass all that had happened. "Them coming like they did." "The Lord works in ways we cannot see," Naomi replied. "Sometimes through fire and loss, he builds stronger bonds than we knew possible." Christopher stared into the flames, his voice dropping lower. "Truth is, I'm scared, Naomi." "Scared of losing it all again." "The railroad won't stop here. You know that as well as I do." "I know fear," she said, her words gentle but firm. "My people have known it for generations, but fear does not win unless we let it." She reached across and touched his hand. "You are not alone anymore, Christopher Boone. Remember what you saw today. These people, they stand with us now." The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across their faces. Christopher looked down at Naomi's hand on his, weathered and strong, and felt something settle in his soul. She was right, he wasn't alone anymore. Whatever came next, they would face it together, surrounded by a community that had finally chosen to see past differences and stand as one. The morning sun cast long shadows across Christopher's weathered kitchen table as he stared at the letter in his hands. The paper was crisp, expensive, nothing like the rough pages he used for his own correspondence. The railroad's embossed letterhead seemed to mock him with its elegance. 7 days, he muttered, reading the crucial line again. "Sell within 7 days, or face the consequences of your stubbornness." Outside, a meadowlark's song carried through the open window, accompanied by the gentle clinking of Naomi's pots as she prepared their evening meal. The domestic sound stood in sharp contrast to the threat he held in his hands. The courier who'd delivered it had barely waited for Christopher's acknowledgement before spurring his horse away, as if afraid to linger. Christopher folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. The smell of fresh cornbread and beans drew him towards the kitchen, where Naomi stood at the stove, her grey-streaked hair neatly braided down her back. She turned at his approach, her keen eyes reading the worry in his face. "Something troubles you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Had a letter today." Christopher settled into his usual chair as Naomi began serving their simple supper. "From the railroad." She placed a full plate before him, then sat across the table, waiting. Steam rose from the bowls between them, but neither reached for their spoons. "They're demanding I sell," he continued, pulling out the letter. 7 days to decide, or they say they'll make sure I regret it." His voice grew quiet. "After the barn burning, I reckon they mean to follow through." Naomi's face hardened. "These men, they speak with forked tongues, like those who took our lands." She reached across the table, her work-worn hand covering his. "But you have something they do not expect. What's that? Truth stands with you. Justice stands with you." Her dark eyes held his. "And so do I." Christopher felt the weight of her words settle into his chest, warming him more than any meal could. They ate in thoughtful silence, the letter lying between them like a shadow on the tablecloth. As the sun set, painting the kitchen walls in amber light, Christopher found his mind racing with possibilities. none of them peaceful. After supper, he stepped out onto the porch while Naomi cleared away the dishes. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, diamond bright and distant. The night air carried the scent of sage and the lonely call of a coyote from the hills. Back and forth he paced, his boots striking a steady rhythm on the wooden boards. 7 days. The railroad men thought they could break him with threats and violence, just as they'd broken others before him. The burning barn was just the beginning. He knew that much. Hours passed. Naomi had long since returned to her cabin with a quiet good night, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The moon rose, casting silver light across the ranch yard. Christopher's steps never faltered as he wrestled with his choice. He could sell, take whatever money they offered, and start fresh somewhere else. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But as he gazed out at the land that had become his home, he knew he couldn't. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Naomi and her grandchildren, about the neighbors who'd helped rebuild, about right and wrong. Lord, he whispered into the night, give me strength to do what's right. A peace settled over him then, as tangible as a warm blanket on a cold night. The answer had been there all along, waiting for him to find the courage to embrace it. He would not sell, would not bow to threats and bullies, no matter the cost. Dawn found him still on the porch, watching as the first light touched the eastern hills. He hadn't slept, but his mind was clear. Inside, he pulled on his best shirt, the one he'd worn to court, and strapped on his gun belt. The weight of the revolver felt foreign. He hadn't carried it since buying the ranch. Christopher moved through his morning chores with deliberate care, feeding the remaining animals, checking the water trough, ensuring everything was in order. He had no way of knowing what would happen in town, but something told him this day would change everything. As he saddled his horse, he heard footsteps approaching. Naomi stood in the barn doorway, a small package wrapped in cloth in her hands. I saw you on the porch all night, she said softly. You've made your decision. Christopher tightened the cinch strap before answering. Yes, Mom. I'm riding into town, going to tell those railroad men face to face, this land ain't for sale. Not now. Not ever. She nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. Then take this. She handed him the package. Fry bread and dried beef. A warrior needs strength. He tucked the food into his saddlebag, touched by her thoughtfulness. Thank you, Naomi, for everything. Go with God, she replied, touching his arm briefly. But come back to us. Christopher swung into the saddle, adjusting his hat against the rising sun. His horse, sensing his mood, danced slightly beneath him. Looking down at Naomi, he managed a small smile. I aim to, he said quietly. Then he turned his horse toward town, toward whatever waited for him there. The morning light stretched his shadow long across the ground as he rode, a solitary figure moving purposefully toward his destiny. Behind him, Naomi watched until he disappeared around the bend, her lips moving in silent prayer. The ranch lay quiet in the early morning light, waiting to see what the day would bring. Christopher pushed through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, squinting as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, and the creak of floorboards announced his entrance. The usual afternoon chatter died down as heads turned his way. At a corner table, 3 railroad men sat playing cards, their expensive suits standing out among the working clothes of regular customers. The eldest of them, grey-haired and sharp-featured, was Henry Wallace, the same agent who'd confronted him outside the courthouse. The man's thin smile reminded Christopher of a rattler about to strike. Well, if it isn't our stubborn friend, Wallace called out, laying down his cards. Come to talk business at last? Christopher walked steadily toward their table, aware of every eye in the room following him. His boots echoed against the wooden floor, each step measured and deliberate. The weight of his gun belt felt heavy, but his voice remained calm. "Figured we should settle this face to face." Wallace gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, Mr. Boone. Let's be civilized about this." Christopher remained standing. The two younger railroad men shifted in their seats, hands drifting toward their coats. The bartender slowly moved a shotgun within easy reach, watching the scene unfold. Wallace pulled an envelope from his vest pocket and placed it on the table. $5,000. More than fair for that worthless patch of dirt. He smiled again, all teeth and no warmth. Think what you could do with that kind of money. Buy yourself a proper ranch somewhere else, one without so many complications. The saloon had grown so quiet Christopher could hear the tick of the clock behind the bar. $5,000 was more money than he'd ever seen. It could buy him a fresh start, somewhere far from trouble. But Naomi's face flashed in his mind, her dignity, her trust, her people's stolen legacy. No. The word came out firm and clear. Wallace's smile vanished. No. Perhaps you misunderstand the situation. This is a generous offer. Much more generous than what's likely to happen if you continue being difficult. I understand just fine. Christopher's voice carried across the silent room. But that land ain't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Every man has his price. Wallace sneered, reaching for the envelope. Not this time. Christopher squared his shoulders. In fact, I'm signing half that ranch over to Naomi Whitefeather and her people, putting right what was stolen from them 30 years ago. A glass shattered somewhere in the back of the saloon. Wallace's face darkened like a thundercloud. His two companions stood up slowly, hands hovering near their guns. You'd give prime railroad land to Indians? Wallace spat the word like poison. To its rightful owners. Christopher corrected quietly. The silver beneath Dry Creek can be worked fair and proper, with profits shared honest. That's my final word. The younger railroad men looked to Wallace for direction, gunmetal glinting dully in the lamplight. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Christopher's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his hands steady at his sides. Then a chair scraped back. Old Tom Miller, the blacksmith, stood up from his usual table. "The man's right," he announced, moving to stand beside Christopher. "Them papers was legal. Court said so." Another figure rose, Sarah Jenkins, who ran the dry goods store. Naomi Whitefeather's a good woman. Raised them grandchildren proper after their parents passed. If Mr. Boone says share the land, I reckon that's fair. One by one, townspeople stood up. The preacher, the livery stable owner, even the bartender set down his shotgun and nodded firmly. Within moments, half the saloon had moved to cluster around Christopher, a living wall of support. Wallace's face twisted as he looked at the crowd. His men's hands trembled near their weapons, but they'd lost their nerve for violence. Too many witnesses, too many respected townspeople willing to testify. "You're making a mistake," Wallace snarled, shoving back from the table. "The railroad doesn't forget those who stand in its way." "Neither do we," the blacksmith rumbled, massive arms crossed over his chest. Wallace snatched up the envelope and stormed towards the door, his men following quickly behind. The saloon doors banged shut behind them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone let out a long breath, and the tension broke like a fever. "That was something to see," the bartender said, shaking his head. "Drinks on the house for Mr. Boone." But Christopher politely declined. "Much obliged to you all," he said quietly, looking around at his neighbors. "I won't forget this." "Ain't nothing but right," Sarah Jenkins replied. "About time somebody stood up to them railroad bullies." Christopher nodded his thanks and walked out into the afternoon sunlight. His legs felt shaky now that it was over, but his spirit was strong. He mounted his horse and turned toward home, toward Naomi, toward a future built on justice rather than greed. The gathered townspeople watched him ride away, their respect for the quiet rancher who'd chosen right over money growing with each steady hoofbeat. In the saloon behind them, life gradually returned to normal, but something had changed in Trinidad that day, something that would be remembered for years to come. The morning sun painted Trinidad's streets gold as townspeople made their way to church. The white clapboard building stood proud against the Colorado sky, its bell still echoing across the valley. Inside, sunlight streamed through simple glass windows, casting warm patterns across wooden pews filled with Sunday-best clothes and expectant faces. Reverend Matthews stood at his pulpit, his weathered Bible open before him. His voice carried clear and strong through the hushed sanctuary. Yesterday, we witnessed something remarkable in our town. A man chose righteousness over riches, justice over greed. His eyes found Christopher, sitting quietly in a back pew, and Naomi with her grandchildren several rows ahead. When Christopher Boone stood in that saloon and declared he would share his land with those who had lost it unjustly, he showed us what it means to live by faith. The Reverend's words rang with conviction. As it says in Micah, "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Heads nodded throughout the congregation. Sarah Jenkins reached over to squeeze Naomi's hand. Even the banker's wife, who usually kept to herself, smiled warmly at Naomi's youngest grandson. After the service, people lingered on the church steps longer than usual. Where once Naomi's family might have been politely ignored, now they found themselves surrounded by genuine welcomes. Mrs. Peterson invited them to Sunday dinner. The schoolteacher asked if Naomi's grandchildren might join classes in the fall. Christopher watched from the shade of an old oak tree, his heart full. The sight of Naomi's dignified smile as she accepted these long-overdue kindnesses made his stand against the railroad worth every risk. By early afternoon, the streets had quieted as families settled into their Sunday rest. Christopher was mending a broken chair on his porch when he heard the rapid approach of hoofbeats. A boy from the telegraph office reined his horse to a stop at the gate. "Mr. Boone, important message for you, sir." The boy waved a yellow paper excitedly. Christopher set down his tools and walked over, pressing a penny into the boy's hand as he took the telegram. His eyes widened as he read, "Christopher Boone, Trinidad, Colorado Territory, have reviewed your deed claim stop. Denver Silver Mining Syndicate interested in negotiating terms. Stop can meet tomorrow to discuss partnership stop. Reply if agreeable. James Harrison, President." Christopher's hands trembled slightly. This was no railroad strong-arm tactic. The Denver Silver Mining Syndicate was known for fair dealing and solid operations. He hurried to saddle his horse and ride to Naomi's small house near the creek. She was in her garden when he arrived, teaching her granddaughter about healing herbs. The afternoon sun caught the silver in her dark hair as she straightened to greet him. "The Denver Syndicate wants to talk terms," he said without preamble, holding out the telegram. "Tomorrow. They're willing to negotiate proper rights to work the silver." Naomi read the message carefully, her expression thoughtful. "These are good people?" she asked. Christopher nodded. "Best reputation in the territory. They've worked fair with other landowners, shared profits honest." He hesitated. "Would you ride in with me tomorrow? This concerns your people's future, too." A small smile touched Naomi's lips. "Yes, we will face this together." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Christopher and Naomi set out early, their horses' hooves raising small dust clouds on the trail to town. They made quite a sight riding side by side, the quiet rancher and the dignified Ute woman, headed to shape their shared destiny. The mining syndicate's representatives waited in the hotel's private dining room, 3 well-dressed men who rose politely when Christopher and Naomi entered. James Harrison, the president, had kind eyes behind his spectacles and a manner that put them at ease. "Mr. Boone, Mrs. Whitefeather," he greeted them, gesturing to chairs. "We've heard much about recent events here. I must say, your stand against the railroad impressed us greatly." Over coffee and a light lunch, they discussed terms. The syndicate would provide equipment and experienced miners. Profits would be split fairly between the company, Christopher's deed rights, and Naomi's people's claim. Most importantly, they would ensure minimal disruption to the land and water sources. "We believe in building lasting relationships with communities," Harrison explained, spreading out a detailed map. "There's enough silver in that creek bed to benefit everyone for years to come, if we work it right." Hours passed as they reviewed documents, asked questions, and carefully considered each point. The afternoon sun was lowering toward the mountains when they finally shook hands on the agreement. "We'll have formal contracts drawn up within the week," Harrison promised. "In the meantime, our surveyors can begin marking the most promising sites." Christopher and Naomi rode home in companionable silence as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Both were tired, but carried a deep sense of rightness about the day's work. At the fork where their paths divided, Naomi surprised Christopher by asking, "Will you share supper with us? The children would like to hear about today." His heart warmed at the invitation. "Much obliged, I'd like that." In Naomi's snug house, they sat around the table while her granddaughter served bowls of fragrant stew. Lamplight caught the eager faces of the children as Christopher and Naomi took turns explaining what the mining agreement would mean for their future. "Will we be rich?" the youngest boy asked, eyes wide. Naomi smiled gently. "We will have enough. More importantly, we will have justice and hope for tomorrow." Christopher watched her in the soft firelight, struck by how right this felt. Sharing a meal, sharing plans, sharing dreams of a future built on trust and respect. The warmth in his chest had nothing to do with the stew, and everything to do with the family gathered around this table. As night settled over the valley, coyotes began their evening songs in the distance. But inside, the lamplight glowed steady and bright, illuminating faces tired but content, hearts full of quiet hope for the days ahead. The morning dew still clung to the grass when the first wagons rumbled up to Christopher's ranch. Their wooden wheels creaked under loads of fresh-cut timber, the sweet scent of pine filling the air. Workers jumped down, tools clanking, ready to begin the day's labor of raising the new barn. Christopher stood on his porch, coffee cup warming his hands, watching Naomi's grandchildren dart between the wagons with excited shouts. Their laughter rang clear across the yard, no longer shadowed by want or worry. Just yesterday, he and Naomi had signed the final papers with the Denver Silver Mining Syndicate, their hands steady as they wrote their names beneath the $5 million figure that would change everything. "Uncle Christopher," young Joseph, Naomi's youngest grandson, called out. "Will the barn have a hayloft for us to play in?" Christopher smiled, remembering his own childhood days in sweet-smelling hay. "Reckon it will. A proper one, too." Inside his ranch house, spread across the kitchen table, lay the documents that had transformed their futures. Half of the syndicate's payment, $2,500,000, was already secured in trust for Naomi's people. The papers outlined plans for new schools, vast grazing lands, and essential supplies that would sustain generations to come. Naomi appeared from around the corner of the house, carrying a basket of fresh biscuits for the workers. Her dark eyes met Christopher's, sharing a moment of quiet understanding. The weight of past injustices could never be fully lifted, but here, now, some measure of balance had been restored. "The foreman says the frame will be up by sundown," she said, joining him on the porch. They watched as her eldest grandson helped the workers unload lumber, eager to be part of the rebuilding. Throughout the day, the new barn took shape against the Colorado sky. Each beam and board represented more than just walls and roof. They were building blocks of renewed dignity, of prosperity earned through patience and principle. The sound of hammers rang out like bells of celebration, marking their triumph over greed and despair. As the afternoon sun began its westward slide, Christopher paused in his work of directing the construction. He watched Naomi teaching her granddaughter to tend the new kitchen garden, their voices carrying soft and clear on the breeze. The sight filled his heart with a lightness he had never known before. This was what the Lord had meant him to see that first night, when he'd prayed for more than what men could measure. Not just silver in the ground or timber in a barn, but the true wealth of justice served, promises kept, and families restored to their rightful dignity. Autumn painted the Colorado hills in soft golds and crimsons as the Sabbath sun began its descent behind the mountains. The rebuilt ranch stood proud against the evening sky, its fresh painted walls and sturdy fences a testament to months of dedicated work. Warm lamplight spilled from every window, casting welcoming squares of gold onto the packed earth of the yard. Inside the ranch house kitchen, Naomi moved with practiced grace, lighting the brass lamp that Christopher had bought her in Trinidad. The flame caught and grew, filling the room with a gentle glow that matched the contentment in her eyes. The aroma of fresh-baked bread and stewing venison drifted through the air, promising comfort after evening worship. Down by Dry Creek, where silver lay hidden deep beneath the soil, children's laughter rang out clear and sweet. Naomi's grandchildren played near the water's edge, their voices mixing with the gentle burble of the stream. Their clothes were new, their faces bright with health and happiness, a far cry from the worried looks they'd worn just months before. The one-room church, freshly whitewashed and topped with a modest steeple, stood as the heart of their growing community. Inside, worn wooden pews held a gathering of neighbors, ranch hands, townspeople, and members of Naomi's extended family. The walls resonated with the sound of voices raised in song as Christopher stood at the front, leading the congregation in Amazing Grace. His clear tenor voice carried the familiar melody, steady and sure. The hymn spoke of being lost and found, of grace appearing in life's darkest hours, words that echoed his own journey from loneliness to belonging. As he sang, his gaze swept across the gathered faces, each one a reminder of the miracle that had grown from that $10 purchase. When the final notes faded into reverent silence, Christopher bowed his head. The weight of all that had transpired settled over him like a warm blanket. He thought back to that first night, sleeping alone by a cold hearth, surrounded by broken dreams and rotting timber. Now the ranch bustled with life and purpose. The barn stood tall again, filled with healthy livestock. The fields promised a good harvest, and the mining operation ran smoothly, providing honest work and fair wages to all. But more precious than any silver vein or restored building was the family he'd found. Naomi's quiet strength and unwavering faith had become the cornerstone of his world. Her grandchildren called him Uncle, their trust a gift beyond price. The community that had once mocked his purchase now gathered regularly to break bread and share stories, proving that mercy could overcome prejudice and justice could heal ancient wounds. Christopher raised his head, meeting Naomi's gentle smile across the church room. In that moment, his heart overflowed with gratitude. "I bought a ruined ranch for $10. He reflected silently. But what I found inside was worth far more than silver. I found a family, a faith, and a future. The evening light streamed through the church's windows, painting everything in hues of gold as the congregation joined together in one final hymn of thanksgiving. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.